We'll take a musical journey in this hour of the program with Loreena McKennitt. If the name does not automatically ring a bell, her sound is unmistakable. You've probably heard this. The Mummers Dance from 1997, perhaps the best known of Loreena McKennitt's songs, but she's got a whole lot more. Loreena McKennitt is Canadian, born in Manitoba, now living in Ontario. By the musical numbers, 14 million albums sold worldwide over a catalog spanning 7 studio albums, 3 seasonal recordings, 6 live recordings, 3 compilations, and 3 DVDs. She's won Canada's Top Music Prize, the Juno Award, twice, and been nominated for Grammys twice. And she'll be in our region later in the month. Loreena McKennitt, thanks so much for joining us on The Exchange.
Well, I'm delighted to be here.
It's very good to have you. Do you come from a musical family? I'm curious to know who in your background would have been musicians.
No, I don't come from a musical family. The community that I grew up in, however, was quite musical. We had it was a small community of about 3,000 people, but a large portion of that community came from or had a German Mennonite background, and music is so central to that culture. So I had a very influential music teacher starting at the age of 5, and I started piano then, and I sang in a children's choir starting then. So I would say that largely was responsible for my the direction I've taken professionally.
I'm intrigued by the talk of the German Mennonite musical tradition. Didn't realize there was such a thing, but that's my own blindness.
I think in Germany, for example, I mean, music has been central to their culture for hundreds of years. When you think of a lot of the composers that came from that region, and they really held on to particularly the classical music, but it was also very rich in the various churches and denominations. And this was certainly brought back to the community where I grew up. So, as I say, there was about 3,000 people, and I think there were about 13 churches in the community. And the schools had the choirs through all the grades, from grade 1 to grade 12. We had music festivals and operettas and talent nights and variety nights. So there was just this ongoing parade of musical activities.
But despite this immersion in music, your intention, at least for a while, was veterinary school, I understand.
Yes, I think this stems from the fact that my father was a livestock dealer, and my grandparents lived on the family farm just a couple blocks from where we lived in town. And my brother and I spent a lot of our growing up years and days on the farm, a lot around the various animals. And I would take a love for particularly the young ones and be trying to fix and nurse them and, cuddle the cats in the hayloft. All these sorts of things. I'm sure there are many children who grow up, having a passion for animals, and therefore they think they're going to be a veterinarian. But I continue to have a passion for animals. I find I'm constantly rescuing some creature or another.
Got to make sure they're all taken care of. Did you say that music chose you rather than you choosing it? I mean, you'd been training, as you point out, from age 5. Was there any particular reluctance on your part?
No, there wasn't reluctance. I think it stems more from the fact that I had really set my eyes on being a veterinarian. When I became a teenager, I was listening to Peter, Paul and Mary, Simon and Garfunkel, Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell, and I very much felt akin to folk music. But I didn't feel it was persuasive enough for me to say, right, that's what I want to do. It wasn't until I heard Celtic music, more particularly Irish, Scottish, English folk music in a folk club in Winnipeg. And as soon as I heard it, it was almost like an involuntary reaction. I was instinctively drawn to it. It was less a matter of that my family heritage comes from Scotland and Ireland, but rather there was something in the music itself that was very, very infectious. So I knew whether I was going to adopt it as a professional path or not, I needed to be involved in that music. So I started learning some of the repertoire, continued to hang out amongst these people at the folk club, and then started weaving those pieces into some of my other performing opportunities.
I was reading also about your discovery of, I mean, not like you discovered them, but that they were in a museum, but you saw Celtic artifacts in Venice, in Italy, and were inspired by that.
Well, this was quite pivotal because up until that time I was of the understanding, as many people are, that the Celts were people that came primarily from Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Brittany, etc. But this exhibition, that was the first exhibition ever assembled, the most extensive one ever assembled on the Celts. A lot of the artifacts had emerged from the former Soviet bloc countries like Lithuania, Ukraine, and so on. And I realized part of the point of the exhibition was to illustrate to people that these were a vast collection of tribes that had fanned out across Europe and into Asia Minor and dated back to about 500 BC.
Here's our fascinating story of them and of you as well. We'll leave with Bonnie Portmore, which was used as a theme for the Highlander movie series, and come back and talk more with Loreena McKennitt in a minute or two here on The Exchange. Star of the County Down, a song from Loreena McKennitt, who is our guest on the Jefferson Exchange today. Prior to her appearance in the region for a couple of concerts, she'll be in Reading on March 20th. She'll be at the Rogue Theater in Grants Pass on March 22nd, which I see is sold out already. She'll be in Eugene at the Holt Center on March 25th. She's our guest here on the Jefferson Exchange today, and you can visit with us here. 800-838-3760, our phone number, email address jx@jeffnet.org. Loreena, we were just talking about the Celtic influence in the world, which, as you pointed out, is not restricted to the parts of the world we tend to assume, much more widespread than that. And in fact, into parts of Europe, we really didn't expect to hear of Celtic influences.
Yes, this was really quite startling. I began this exploration really in the northwest corner of Spain, in Galicia, but I would come to learn that the Celts were, like Milan in Italy was a Celtic settlement, Coimbra in Portugal, Leiden in the Netherlands, they were all over Germany, and then there were some that tried to sack Delphi in Greece around 275 BC. They were through Anatolia and Turkey. Some of my more interesting travels took me up to a museum in northwest China in a city called Urumqi. And there was, they had mummies that had red hair and were wrapped in tartans. And they spoke a language that is called, I believe it's pronounced Tocharian. And in the Indo-European group of languages, this language is one side of the spectrum, and the Celtic or Gaelic languages are on the other. These mummies dated back to about 1000 BC and are believed to have been quite possibly some of the precursors to the Celts, who were roughly identified around 500 BC. So it's been a fascinating process of self-education in terms of history and culture.
That's wild. I hadn't heard about the mummies of Urumqi before.
Oh, yes.
That's pretty amazing. So given that, there are places in the world where the musical influences that are most often attributed to you, the Celtic and the Middle East, and they certainly cross in parts of Spain, don't they?
They do. Or in Brittany. What I've tried to do was, and I'm not going at it from a strictly academic standpoint, that I'm bringing, historically accurate instruments, but what I'm trying to do is really as much an act of musical travel writing, that as I'm discovering and learning, I'm weaving this inspiration back into my musical documents and sharing that with people who might be able to vicariously, have a similar experience.
You certainly seem to have some musical freedom to be able to do so, rather than trying to stick with whatever the tastes of the time might be. And part of this is from controlling your own record label. I mean, that is your label, isn't it?
Yes. It is a label that I set up in 1985 when I made my first recording. I often say that I wish I could say that I knew what I was doing at the very beginning, but I didn't. But I was armed with a very good book called How to Make and Sell Your Own Recording by Diane Rappaport, and I used it as a Bible in terms of, constructing budgets and looking at the technical or the publishing and copyright issues, the duplication and artwork and so on. So it was really quite invaluable. I had no idea where my career would go. there was certainly a point in time where, particularly when I would go down to Los Angeles and speak with my dear friends at Warner Brothers Records, there was a point they felt that it was sort of uncomely, you might say, that an artist is wandering around without a manager. And I used to meet prospective managers on a fairly regular basis when I go down to Los Angeles. But I realized by that time I had really established a good part of my own international business, and I was really just looking for support in the United States, and realized I was probably unmanageable. So I've continued on to this day to run my own. It's really two small businesses. One is the record production or the music production and distribution, and the other, of course, is the touring.
Mm-hmm. Is there any special significance to the Quinlan Road? Is it, or is it where you get the mail?
Well, it was the road that I lived on when I moved to Stratford, Ontario, from Winnipeg in 1981. And I thought, and again, not knowing anything about anything, I thought, well, they can call it Abbey Road. Well, I will call this Quinlan Road.
Now it all makes sense. Okay.
Of course.
But I'm reminded though of your fellow country person, Joni Mitchell, who also has maintained great creative control over her own work over the years and has seemed quite satisfied by that. I wonder if she was any inspiration to you in that sense.
Not really. I wasn't really aware of how she was managing her career and her creations. The more I came to learn about the music industry, I thought, well, there's some wonderful and very strong aspects to it, but there are also some pretty dodgy ones. And I felt that I came to accept that I would probably write and compose less, but if I could look after what I did compose or did create better by doing it myself, then that was the way I needed to do it. So it is the way things have continued even to this day. I'm, heavily involved in every aspect of the business side of things. But sometimes it's a bit like a split personality, because when the times of the artist need to come along to perform or to create, it's like, it's like visiting another room in the house that you haven't been to for a while.
I can imagine. It's sort of like, well, I got the checkbook balance. Now I got to go play some music.
But it's good, I think creativity, most people, if not everyone, has great creative energy, and I think that there's a narrative to artists that is not dissimilar to women in terms of there was a period of time there women were deemed too precious or insufficient to be able to balance books or change a tire or something like this, and I think artists sadly have adopted a position where they're too precious or something to become involved in the business. I think people don't have to perhaps be as deeply involved as I am, but I think many artists have greater capacity for the business side than they may realize.
Loreena McKennitt is our guest on the Jefferson Exchange, musician, composer, singer, and as you hear, business person as well. She'll be playing concerts in Reading, Grants Pass, and Eugene between March 20th and 25th. You can join us on the Jefferson Exchange now. Questions or comments, welcome. 800-838-3760 by phone, by email, jx@jeffnet.org. Loreena, I saw a clip of you from a Canadian Star Search kind of a show. I mean, was acting a career choice at one point?
Yes, when I was in Winnipeg at the end of the 70s, I was working in musical theater, a bit of theater, also playing in some lounges. But there was a period from about 1978 to 1985 that I was, I hadn't really set my focus on what I wanted to do. When I moved to Stratford in 81, it was primarily to perform in a Gilbert and Sullivan musical. The second year, I had auditioned for the acting company and got two good understudies. Then I composed music for a couple of productions there, but by 1985, I was developing this passion for the Celtic music to the extent that I thought, right, I think I'm going to see if I can make something of this.
Go ahead.
There were those years that I was really trying to focus on what I was going to do.
It looked like a pretty good Eliza Doolittle from what I saw of the clip.
It was great fun.
I understand that was your first trip to Toronto, and you ended up at some point busking on the street?
Yes, well, in 1980, that television contest, which was a national one, was the mechanism that first brought me to Toronto. But it wasn't until about 1985, after I had produced my first recording, Elemental, which I recorded and mixed in 1 week in a studio in a barn. I'd run off about 30 cassettes, and I gave about 15 to friends and family, and I thought, well, what am I going to do with the rest of these? So I decided, busking has an honorable tradition in Europe. I'll see how it goes in North America. So I headed down to the St. Lawrence Market in Toronto on early Saturday mornings, and I would sit out front and play, and I would sell my cassettes, and people would put money in my hat. And I came to realize that this was actually quite a successful way of making money. And soon people went to retailers in the city and were asking for my cassettes. And the phone calls would start to come in from various retailers saying, we have people asking for your music. Could you sell some of it to us on consignment? So I went on to busk in Dublin and London and Vancouver. And there was something I really liked about that experience. It was very honest, If people didn't they just walked by.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, if they did, they stay, and you got to chat with people and know them. And I think this is probably one of the aspects I like about this trio performance that we're on now, because we're traveling only 3 hours each day or so. We actually get to have a sense of where we are and meet people, whether they're, so-called fans of mine or not. Mm-hmm. It's just really nice to meet people.
Describe the trio setup, if you would.
Well, I'm working with two of my longtime colleagues, Brian Hughes, who plays guitars, bouzouki, and oud, and he's a very accomplished jazz artist in his own right and has his own recordings. I'm also working with Caroline Lavelle, also a very accomplished artist with her own recordings and separate career. She plays cello, recorder, and a bit of concertina. And part of the reason we've decided to come out as a trio has been, over the years, people have been saying, well, we've enjoyed the band and we've enjoyed the Eastern and Middle Eastern, but we're really missing some of the earlier, simpler, traditional pieces. So we thought that this might be the occasion to do this, also because we hadn't been in this market since 2007, and the industry is in such an advanced state of collapse. I didn't want to come in with a very big and expensive infrastructure, so we sort of married those two.
Let's hear some of the music that's been coming out. This is from that trio album. This is called The Lady of Shalott. Let's listen to some of that. So the music by you, Loreena McKennitt, but the words by another famous name.
Yes, also by Tennyson.
And so what's it like to write music on some quite respected bits of literature that existed before you came on the scene?
Well, it's a very interesting creative process because not unlike, let's say, working in film or theater, it's not all about you. Just the music. It's really trying to find a musical companion that supports the imagery, the narrative, and the sentiment of the words. So when I was working on this the back of that farmhouse on Quinlan Road in 1985, I remember the piano being right by the windows and looking out in this gorgeous kind of forested area, and thinking I need to bring something very English sounding, in that very English folk modality to these lyrics, and something quite pastoral. So, yeah.
When I hear your sound, it's a very layered sound, which is why when you said you recorded Elemental in a week and mixed it in a week, that's pretty amazing. But there's a lot of production involved in your pieces now.
Yes, there is. I mean, I think many of the recent recording sessions have been a very luxurious, creative exploration process. We've been working at Peter Gabriel's studio in England, which is in a renovated or restored mill in the Wiltshire countryside. And as I became interested in this Celtic history that brought me into the East and Middle East, I wanted to explore how to bring those modalities into the more overtly Irish, Scots, English kind of. But there's not a clear or direct line to that, and I often felt like I was in a kitchen experimenting with recipes and saying, well, too much of a dash of this will destroy the whole thing. I look at it, let's say, structurally. From rhythmic standpoint, I might begin with a boran pattern in the Irish tradition and see if and how, let's say, a doumbek or a tablas might configure into that mathematical equation, which is a boran pattern. Or I might say, well, instead of having a drone from the pipes, I'm going to have a drone from a hurdy-gurdy or a tambura, and just see how the mixture of the imagery kind of takes a person to a different place. So the recording process became like a big experimental kitchen. And, I think some of the experiments turned out better than others.
So do you end up with recordings that have many, many, many tracks, not all of which are heard?
Oh, yes. I think we built the Highwayman, 2 or 3 times. La Serenissima we built 2 or 3 times. It was interesting to think about the Mummers dance because we had already gone into the studio to record the first tracks, and I was still writing material. And in the big room at Peter Gabriel's studio, at the very back, around there, isolation booths, and I had set up a little writing booth in the back. And I'm a very insecure creative person, and I'd said to my the violinist Hugh Marsh, who's an extraordinary musician, to come back, and I just wanted to play for him a bit of the what I was working on. And what it was the beginnings of the Mummers dance. And I said to him, "Oh God, Hugh, I think this is I don't think it's very good, but what do you think? Do you think I should continue working on it?" And he said, "Oh yes, no, I think you should keep working on that." But it's I think most creative people will say that it's an unpredictable process at best, and sometimes it's just, for me, it's shuffling the deck. I see traveling as my drug of choice. I like to see different people and different places, and then start looking at patterns or commonalities.
Were there places you walked down the street and you heard a sound and went, whoa, what was that? And went back and found out what it was?
Well, I think the first time I went to Marrakesh and I heard the call to prayer, that was a pretty powerful sound. And so when we were working on the Mask and Mirror, because that project began in the northwest corner of Spain, Galicia, but it was impossible to be in Spain and not take on board the incredible influence of Morocco and the Arabic culture. So I went to Marrakesh and heard that sound and wove it into Mystic's Dream.
All right, all kinds of great stuff to talk about with Loreena McKennitt. Let's listen to All Souls Night as we head to this break. We'll come back and talk more with her in about a minute and a half here on the Jefferson Exchange. McKennitt in full circle as we conclude our talk with Loreena McKennitt here on the Jefferson Exchange, or continue it, I should say. It'll conclude in a few minutes. You can join us on the Jefferson Exchange as we talk to Loreena McKennitt, the Canadian singer, composer, musician, philanthropist, you name it. She's done a lot of things in the world. She'll be in the area in Reading at the Civic Auditorium on March 20th, at the Rogue Theatre in Grants Pass on March 22nd, and in the Holt Center in Eugene on March 25th. You can join us here on the Jefferson Exchange at 800-838-3760. Our email address is jx@jeffnet.org. We're just talking about the search for musical influences and just the general attention to sounds that people make around the world. You have a great belief, I gather, in the power of music that goes beyond just the mental and emotional.
Yes, I think music is an underappreciated medium. I also feel that the music industry it grew up so quickly and without I just don't feel that it's it's known what it's been so-called trading in. And I worry that also because we seem to, not just from an industry standpoint, but probably more importantly, just having music in our everyday life, that we're missing an exquisite human experience. In Canada, in various schools, I know that the music programs have diminished, and if children are going to be exposed to music, it's more informal lessons after school. But when I think of some of the places I've traveled where music is so embedded into the everyday existence, and that it just makes life so much richer, if not more soothing at times, I've come to be somewhat concerned that we're missing something here.
I'm surprised to hear that you've had cuts in music programs in schools in Canada as well, because a lot of cuts came during the recession in America to schools in the United States as well.
Yes, I think it's quite short-sighted because there seems to be a growing body of research that's showing how many other dividends there are for children and humans when they are engaged in music. And there's a wonderful initiative at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. It's called the Music Lab, where they really are doing a lot of neuroscience research in with respect to music and the brain, and the many different kind of aspects to it. So I think not only is it just a kind of creative expression, I think there are so many other dividends that we're very, very short-sighted. In fact, I feel at times we're heading into a version of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, that other activities with children, particularly connection technologies, are really crowding out being involved in things like music, and particularly music.
Because people are spending their time with their faces and their screens rather than talking to each other and playing music with each other?
Precisely. I mean, I think the misuse and premature use of connection technologies for children is probably one of the biggest contemporary catastrophes. And there's now, because I think it has, because it's only been around for 20 years or so, we still are, I would say, in an experimental phase. And I think there's a lot of very persuasive research that is coming out to show that, yes, there may be beneficial aspects, but there are a lot of detrimental ones as well. And it's probably one of the things I feel most passionate about now.
Mm-hmm. Well, those same devices figure prominently in what you describe as the collapse of the music industry, because when people can get anything for free on a device in their hands, they don't need to go buy a CD or something. So how have you navigated that episode in the music industry's history, which is not a happy one still?
Well, I think the way we've navigated it has been, again, at the onset, me saying, I wish I could say I knew what I was doing, but I think first for me is that I did take charge personally of my own career path and my own business, and I understood it. At the height of my career, which would have been maybe more around 98 or so, I had two offices. I had one in the UK that helped deal with things in Europe, and then another one in Stratford, Ontario, where I live. I think we had upwards of 13 people working for me. Now I have one office, still the one in Stratford, and I have 3 people. So it's a bit of an act of haiku every day. But the good news is, I mean, from myself, I'm now would consider myself a kind of legacy artist. Even though everybody's revenue pie has gotten smaller, that pie is not divided into so many parts as many other artists would with management and so on. So we continue to be healthy and operating, but on a much smaller, with a much smaller infrastructure. And I've also kept my masters, and we do, I'm one of that group of people who have deliberately chosen to stay out of streaming services such as Spotify, because to be paid 10 cents per 1,000 plays doesn't really cover much at all. I think a lot of this technology has served the companies that are advancing them, and perhaps in some ways consumers, But I think when it comes to the people in the creative industries, the creative floor, shall we say, it's absolutely decimating. And I see the book publishing, the news publishing, there are all so many industries that are suffering from, again, we've dismantled in this disruptive innovation, as Silicon Valley likes to talk about it. I don't mind changes, but before you tear down one business model, you really want to have the next one put together and that it's proven and viable. Right now, I feel we're just in a kind of chaotic anarchy.
Oh, have a ship to get to before you sink the first one, in other words.
Exactly.
Okay. Lawrence and Eugene would like to visit. Welcome to the Jefferson Exchange with Loreena McKennitt.
Hi, I want to say that it's a privilege to be listening to Loreena. I've admired her for a long time, and her articulateness in speaking and talking about her worldview is just as wonderful as listening to her music. I wanted to ask about something that was seemingly unorthodox for her when she recorded it, and I've never seen it on YouTube. But her recording of Greensleeves, which she did in the style of Tom Waits, I love that particular piece, and I wondered if she would comment on what inspired her to try to clip her words and make a recording that was not in her usual style.
All right. Thanks for the question, Lawrence.
Well, that was a great moment. Polygram had asked me to record 4 songs for an artist development deal. We were in a studio in Hamilton, a Grant Avenue studio, in fact, started by Daniel Lanmore. And I went in, and we were working away, and the phone rang, and the engineer had to take a phone call. So the group of musicians, we were set up in the studio, and I said, well, while, so-and-so is taking the phone call, why don't we just, joke around? And I said, well, I wonder how Tom Waits would do Greensleeves, And I love Tom Waits. I just think he's an extraordinary musician and wordsmith. So we did it, and unbeknownst to us, the engineer who was keeping half an ear on what we were doing decided to roll the tape. And so it was never meant to be recorded. He just recorded it, and after he'd done so, I thought, well, that might come in handy sometime.
There are a number of stories like that, it seems like, in the recording industry. People who really didn't intend for that to be the take, and it ended up being the take.
Well, it's interesting because there's another one, a piece of Tom Waits that I've just been dying to perform, even on this trio tour, and I've had various people encourage me, but I thought, oh gosh, people haven't come here to hear me do this. But
you talked about your fellow musicians on the trio tour: Brian Hughes playing guitar, bouzouki, and oud; Carolyn Lavelle playing cello, recorder, and concertina. What are you playing in these concerts?
I'm just playing harp and piano.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'm in some other concerts I've performed with accordion and tin whistle, a Middle Eastern instrument called a qanun, but this one it's pretty straight ahead on the piano and harp.
There's certainly a Loreena McKennitt sound. There's also a Loreena McKennitt look, and when I was looking for pictures of you to post on the website to accompany the news of our interview with you, I ran across a picture of a red-headed woman wearing an RCAF uniform, a Royal Canadian Air Force uniform.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, well, it looks like Loreena McKennitt. Explored further. You were honorary colonel in the Royal Canadian Air Force for several years?
Well, about 2007, I was asked to be the honorary colonel of a squadron out of Winnipeg, a search and rescue and transport squadron who fly C-130 Hercules. And then as an honorary colonel, I did that for a number of years, and then about a year and a half ago, I was asked to be the honorary colonel for the RCAF. So now I have a whole other level of roles and duties. It's been an incredible privilege, actually, to hold the role as honorary colonel in the RCF. I was one of many citizens who grew up not having enough of an appreciation for what our men and women in uniform do for us and the international community. and it's been a very sobering education. In my role as the Honorary Colonel for the RCF, my primary focus is to examine family life, which is extremely challenging because over and above the challenges of civilian population and family life, you've got the overlay of these elements of risk, mobility, and separation. So I also have a family centre in Stratford and have been very much focused on themes to do with the family, particularly since 2000. So it's been a good match for me. Sometimes I feel I get more out of the arrangement with the RCF than they do out of me, but it is, if nothing else, it's been an incredible privilege.
You certainly keep busy. I noticed all the methods of philanthropy. You mentioned the Family Center in Stratford. There's the Cook Reese Memorial Fund for Water Search and Safety. There's the Three Oaks Foundation. So you certainly have lots going on. When you're not on tour, though, what do you like to do? What's the thing you like to do the most in your personal life?
Oh, it's hard to say what I like most. I certainly like gardening. I like bicycling, hiking, camping, traveling, seeing different things. They're often quite simple. I feel perhaps the less time I have to do those things, the more precious they become to me. But I love being in the garden. I'm not a fantastic gardener, but I have a fairly substantial garden and am able to grow a fair bit of food.
Sounds like a fairly short growing season in Stratford, though.
It can be. Last year the weather was so wet, and so it was very difficult for many of the plants. Like the tomatoes didn't really ripen until well into August. So that's all good. I think that I've always kept gardening in my life from the time I grew up, and my mother had my brother and I involved in the garden, or my grandparents. And it's really allowed me to stay kind of rooted, given that the other foot is in a profession that doesn't always steer you in that direction.
No, very different worlds, I suppose. But you've certainly nurtured and helped grow a bunch of people with care for your music and what you've been doing. Loreena McKennitt will be in Reading on the 20th, in Grants Pass on the 22nd, and Eugene on the 25th, on tour with Brian Hughes and Caroline Lavelle. Loreena, thank you so much for joining us today on the Jefferson Exchange.
Oh, thank you. It's been great speaking with you.
Okay, we'll go out with The Old Ways, and thank you for listening to the Jefferson Exchange today and this week. Our producer is Emily Curitan, Emily Pfeiffer at the controls today. I'm Jeffrey Riley. Have a great weekend.